Welcome back to the R.M.Williams Outback podcast. Great to have you here. This is Terry Cowley. I'm the host of the podcast and also the senior associate editor of R.M.Williams Outback magazine. We're very grateful to Ram Trucks for sponsoring this podcast. As well as producing Outback magazine for you once every 2 months, we also create other special magazines. The 5th edition in the Great Australian series has just come out, and ecologist Katherine Moseby is on the cover. The magazine features 20 living legends of the bush, and Katherine is certainly one of them. She has spent her career working to solve one of Australia's most complex environmental challenges, feral animals. With her husband and fellow ecologist John Reid, Katherine has established Arid Recovery, an independent not-for-profit organisation running a wildlife reserve in South Australia's arid north. Katherine joins me now. Hi, Katherine.
Hi, Terry. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Tell me a bit about Secret Rocks Nature Reserve, because you've got a colony of numbats that have been reintroduced to a 4,000 hectare safe haven.
Yeah, so we were both living at Roxby and doing Arid Recovery, which is a fenced reserve up at Roxby Downs, and we bought a property on the Eyre Peninsula, which is nice mallee scrub with granite outcrops, and we eventually moved down there and decided to create another safe haven down there. So we've spent the last few years fencing off about 4,000 hectares of mallee and reintroducing locally extinct species. So numbats was the most recent one. We've also got phascogales and we've got bandicoots and plains mice as well that we've reintroduced.
So it's fortified by 25 kilometres of feral-proof fencing.
Yes, which takes a bit of work to maintain. We're just electrifying it at the moment to sort of increase its capacity to repel cats and foxes. But yeah, there's a fair bit of work every week in just driving the fences. I'm sure a lot of your listeners are used to fence checks. We're looking for holes under the fence or any weak points where animals might get in.
So tell me a bit about your background, Katherine, because you had more of an urban childhood, but animals were always part of your life.
Yeah, I grew up in Adelaide in St. Peter's, which is very urban, right near the centre of the city. But we had the River Torrens and we used to go down there and play, and my grandparents had a farm, so I used to go there occasionally as well. And my parents were definitely animal lovers, so we always had pet cats or pet dogs or birds or guinea pigs or rabbits or whatever, was on hand. So yeah, we did grow up around animals.
So I believe when you were young, you dreamed of working for Greenpeace, but at the end of schooling, you were steered towards a science degree.
Yeah, that was very surprising to me as well. So I was an animal lover. I wanted initially to be a vet, and then I decided I wanted to help wildlife instead. So I thought about joining Greenpeace and saving the whales and saving the seals at that time. There was a lot of, seals being slaughtered and things like that. So, but I had an amazing biology teacher. I think everyone can remember a teacher they had at school who was really pivotal in their later life, and he suggested I do a science degree and study ecology, and I'd never heard of ecology before. I didn't know that you could actually work in that field. I thought if you loved animals you had to be a zookeeper or a vet. That was my limited knowledge at that time.
So you ended up working for renowned ecologist David Payton.
Yeah, and Dave's just recently retired in the last couple of years. He's been in South Australia all his life, and he comes from a family who's been in South Australia for many generations. I think his grandfather was Cleland, which the Cleland Reserve is named after in South Australia. And I went to work for him down the southeast at Narcat Conservation Park. And it's the first time I'd ever been alone in the bush. They'd drop us off in the morning and then pick us up in the evening. And the whole day we had to count birds. We were looking at the impacts of honeybees on native wildlife. So we had to collect a lot of data. But yeah, just being alone in the bush all day, it just made me very happy, and I just really enjoyed it.
You really relished that solitude, which probably not everybody would.
I think it's something that scares a lot of people, being alone in the bush. But I think, once you've been sort of pushed into it and you've done it for a while, it's something that it's just amazing. You really start to notice all the birds and the wildlife around you, and things, you just start to sort of be more aware of your surroundings. And we had to do a lot of walking as well, so good exercise and lots of fresh air, and yeah, ended up really enjoying it. The only problem was the southeast is very cold, and we were there over winter camping, and basically drove me northwards into the desert after that, because I just not great with the cold.
Fair enough, I can relate to that. So that experience fundamentally shifted your perspective.
Yeah, I started thinking about conserving whole ecosystems and the whole environment rather than just saving one species. So rather than joining Greenpeace and saving the whales, I was thinking more along the lines of trying to preserve, the whole ecosystem. And I guess I got an understanding then of how many animals have gone extinct in Australia since European settlement, and how many of those animals were still facing extinction today. So that became more of a focus for me after that.
You mentioned Roxby in passing earlier. So at the end of 1992, you headed to Roxby Downs to work on a feral cat project. How did that turn out to be a life-altering decision?
Yeah, well, I met my future husband up there, John Reed, who was an ecologist up there at the time. I was doing some work for Dave Payton again on feral cats, and I'd never really been north of Port Augusta. My family used to go on holidays close to Adelaide, and we'd go overseas to visit our grandparents in England. We didn't really get to experience anything north of Port Augusta, so just going up to Roxby and seeing the desert, I just fell in love with the open skies and the vast landscapes and the less people there, and just the amazing wildlife as well. And yeah, that basically steered me in the direction of arid zone ecology.
Soon after that, you and John started working on calicivirus, which of course was introduced to control rabbits.
Yeah, we weren't really working on the calicivirus, but we took advantage of it. So it came through in about 1995, and it just decimated the rabbits. And up until that point, we'd go spotlighting at Roxby, and we'd be counting rabbits in groups of 5, and you'd see hundreds of them per kilometre of spotlight transit. And then after calicivirus swept through, that dropped down to like 1 or 2 per square kilometre. So really massive decline in rabbits, which was the first time for many, many decades that there'd been that decline. And so we thought, well, this is a great opportunity to try and fence off an area of habitat and try and keep it rabbit free for as long as possible. And then, study what that response of all the native animals is to removing those rabbits. And then we sort of decided if we could remove rabbits from an area, we could do cats and foxes as well. So we expanded that to include rabbits, cats and foxes that we removed from our exposure.
And with some other partners, that really led to the establishment of arid recovery.
That's right. So we had BHP, well, at the time it was Western Mining, we had National Parks and Wildlife, we had Pete Copley, and we had Dave Payton from the University of Adelaide, and John and myself. And yeah, we were the 4 co-founders, and we started off with 14 square kilometres and gradually increased that to 123 square kilometres of fenced area, so over several years. So yeah, it's a lot of work.
What native species have you successfully introduced there? Reintroduced, I should say.
Yeah, we started with stick-nest rats. Then we did bilbies and sharp-bared bandicoots and burrowing bedongs. More recently, we've got western quolls in there, and only in the last couple of years, we've actually reintroduced quarries, which is a little carnivorous marsupial as well. So quite a few species were reintroduced, but we also had some species that just naturally re-established there. They must have been in low density and being eaten by cats and foxes, and then they sort of found their way to the reserve, and they've since boomed. So things like the Spinifex hopping mouse and the plains mouse, they naturally re-established in the reserve, and they're now doing extremely well inside.
You've also supported a number of research projects.
Yeah, one of the main reasons we set up Arid Recovery was as a research site to try and see whether we could look at how we can control cats and foxes and rabbits better, and how we can get animals outside fences. So over the last 25 years, we've had hundreds of research projects and students from different universities and staff that do research as well. And yeah, it's all been sort of working towards that adaptive management of arid lands and trying to reestablish species in the broader landscape.
Tell me about the floppy top fence.
Well, that was one of the original research projects we did when we first put a fence design up for the cats and foxes. We had a design that someone else had used on Wardang Island, and we built a little pen and we put a cat in there, and it got out of that pen in about 36 seconds. So we realised that the fence was not going to be fit for purpose for what we wanted. So we sort of kept adding feral cats. We'd catch feral cats from the surrounding areas, we'd put them in the pen, and then we'd watch how they escape. And then we gradually changed the fence design until we came up with a design where they couldn't get over. And that involved this sort of curved, arced, floppy top on top of the pen, on top of the fence. And so a cat sort of walks up to the fence and looks up, and the curved overhang actually curves right round behind it, so it can't see a way of getting over the fence. And that's been really effective in excluding cats and foxes.
Clever. So no one really knew whether the depleted arid environment could support reintroduced threatened species beforehand.
No, so John Wamsley, he had done some reintroductions around Adelaide in South Australia, and sort of shown that you could fence cats and foxes and get sort of some of those wetter and climate animals, potoroos and things, reintroduced. But no one had ever done it in the arid zone, and we weren't sure if 100 years of rabbits and cattle and sheep had sort of done too much damage. But we found that, as long as we could keep the cats and the rabbits and the foxes out, most of the animals did really well. We did have a couple of species that didn't do so well. So the numbat was one, got taken by native birds of prey, so we couldn't get that one established. And wommer pythons was another one we tried to establish, and it kept getting eaten by native snakes that would eat them. So that was two species where native predators were having an effect. But most of the species, by and large, once we got rid of those cats and foxes, they were fairly simple and easy to reintroduce.
So it was initially intended to be a short stay in Roxby, stretched to a 12-year stint. You got married to John in 1999 and you had 2 daughters.
Yeah, we had 2 girls, and then just before the third one was born, we decided to move down to the Eyre Peninsula. We hadn't really spent much time on the Eyre Peninsula before, but there was a property there, quite a large property, about 260 square kilometres, that we could afford. So we bought that as a bush block and decided to move down there and make a life down there, which was a pretty big change from the desert, sort of arid to semi-arid. But yeah, we still live down there and we love it. It's fantastic down there. It's just a beautiful part of the world, and the Eyre Peninsula is one of the few places where there's quite high native vegetation remnancy there. So we've got about half the native vegetation still intact on the Eyre Peninsula and uncleared. So there's still, some really beautiful areas and some wildlife there. So it's pretty unique.
Indeed, I love it. Visited it many times. Now, you successfully applied to have a heritage agreement applied to that land title, securing the long-term protection of it.
Yeah, this was the first time, I think, in South Australia where someone had attempted to put a heritage agreement on a pastoral lease. So there was a fair bit of paperwork involved and toing and froing to get it done. It did take a number of years to get that heritage agreement put on there. So that means now if we sell the property, no one is allowed to clear it or graze it. It's actually now permanently protected from any sort of domestic stock or clearance, which we're really happy about.
You mentioned earlier there was a lot of work required to maintain fences, but that's really only part of it, isn't it? You've got your trapping, baiting, shooting to keep the numbers of feral animals lower outside the fence, and I guess in a perfect world, non-existent within.
Yeah, well, one of the biggest issues is actually kangaroos, which we were quite surprised about when we first built the exclosure. We didn't realise that grass grew in mallee country. We thought mallee was just basically mallee trees with not much understory. But once we actually excluded the roos and controlled the roos, we found so many plants growing back in that system and so many native grasses that we hadn't seen before coming back. So it really made us aware of how big an issue overgrazing is by kangaroos in that part of the world. And that's mainly because we're south of the dog fence. So if you go north of the dog fence or the dingo fence, there's dingoes there and they control things like goats and wombats and kangaroos, a whole lot of feral and native herbivores. But because we're south of that fence, we didn't have any topwater predators. So these kangaroos are just in super high abundance. So we actually do a fair bit of work controlling kangaroos just to try and get our vegetation protected. Even though we're on a heritage agreement where we don't have sheep or cattle, we still have a lot of grazing pressure from kangaroos. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't realise is kangaroos in high abundance can actually cause, significant damage to vegetation. So we spend a lot of time trying to exclude and control kangaroos, as well as closing down water points so that they don't, have water to drink and that sort of thing. So that might naturally control their numbers.
So technological advances are helping with your monitoring of all this?
Yeah, we use remote cameras, 4G cameras. So anywhere where we have 4G reception, we can use these cameras. And if something goes past the camera, we get an email with the photo on it. That's been really useful for looking for cat incursions or fox incursions inside our fenced area. We're also using something called a Felix, a grooming trap, which John invented to try and control cats. And that sort of uses a whole lot of sensors to detect a cat, and then it sprays a gel onto the fur of the cat. And then when the cat licks the gel off, it ingests the 1080 and dies. So that's a way of making sure that we don't just put 1080 baits around in the environment for native animals to eat. And so this is really containing it to a box, and only cats and foxes are targeted with it. So it's a really good way of reducing the amount of poison that you need to use in the environment. So we're finding that very useful as well.
So these fence safe havens are obviously essential for research and maintaining populations, but the ultimate goal is to successfully reintroduce animals outside the fence.
Yeah, so we can exclude cats and foxes from these fenced areas, but trying to get them back into broader landscapes is a lot harder. We can control foxes using poison baits. They take baits pretty readily. They're scavengers. We can drop baits from planes over large areas, but feral cats are a lot harder to control. They tend to prefer to eat live prey. They only take baits when they're really hungry. So trying to reduce cat numbers down to levels where we can actually get animals back in the wild has been difficult. There's a few things we're looking at. So these Felix grooming traps are handy for trying to control cats. And there's been a new bait developed in Western Australia called Eradicat, which is like a sausage bait, which is a bit more easily for cats to consume. We're also looking at some research at Area Recovery where we're trying to sort of expose some of our threatened species to low levels of cat predation and try and accelerate natural selection and regain behaviours there to sort of make them more predator aware. And we've shown that over several years of exposure, they can actually change their behaviour and their physical traits to be better able to cope with cats. But it's a long road. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. And, we're still hoping that maybe some of these recent advances, genetic advances and things like gene drive, we might be able to use them to help control cats more effectively in the future. But until we do that, we're really going to struggle to get these threatened species out into broader landscapes, because cats are just such efficient predators, and they really do so much damage to our wildlife.
Tell me about this prey naivety work.
Yeah, so that's that work where we are exposing some of these native animals to cats. So our native wildlife didn't evolve with cats, so they haven't got any sort of innate predator responses specifically to cats. So they're very susceptible to cat predation, the way cats hunt, the stalking and pouncing that cats do. So a lot of our native wildlife are really what we call naive to feral cat and the way they hunt. So we're trying to sort of, I guess, accelerate that learning and natural selection by exposing them to just a few cats in a very controlled situation, and hoping that will, stimulate learning and help drive natural selection for better traits.
How's that gone?
Yeah, really interesting. So we've sort of had animals exposed to cats for 5 or 6 years, and you can see the populations of those bedongs. They're getting larger feet, so they're getting bigger, and that probably means they can escape from predators better, or they are a bit too big for cats to eat, the bigger ones. We're seeing things like more wariness. They sort of hesitate to eat and things like that if there's predators around. With bilbies, we saw increased survival in those that have been previously exposed to predators. So yeah, definitely seeing changes in sort of physical and behavioural traits, and in some cases survival. But it's the sort of thing where, we're not going to solve the problems in a couple of years. We really need to be trying to get these animals coexisting with cats as many places as we can, so they do have the chance to evolve these new traits that they need to coexist with them. But that's difficult. As I said before, trying to control cats is not an easy task. But we are seeing some selection for traits, particularly physical traits. So larger bedongs will tend to have larger offspring. So there is some evidence that some of these traits are heritable, and that's what we need to see. We need to see that gradual improvement in traits over time. But we're talking about, long time frames, and trying to keep cat numbers low over long periods is difficult.
So you shared a lot of this research with Daniel T. Blumstein.
Blumstein, yep, he's a well-renowned animal behaviourist from the US.
And you've been collaborating with him on this research for some time.
Yeah, we sort of spoke by email about 10 years ago. I was doing some animal behaviour work looking at how bilbies were reacting to feral cats, and he does a lot of work with fear and predation and how animals respond to that predator risk. And yeah, that developed into a few research grants that we're still collaborating on today. So it's been great having him involved. He's fantastic. He's so enthusiastic, and yeah, really has a great understanding of animal behaviour and how it relates to predation.
So essentially what you were sort of saying to him is that you should just put the predators into the large enclosures with the prey and release the survivors. And he was questioning the ethics of that.
Yeah, and we've had a few conversations about along those lines. So the way that people tend to try and train naive animals against predators is they get like a plastic fox, or they get a stuffed cat, and they try and pair that with an unpleasant experience. So they might, squirt them with water, or they flick them with rubber bands, or they make a loud noise, and they try and sort of get the animal to associate the predator with an unpleasant experience. But the problem with that is that animals are pretty smart, and they soon realize that's just a plastic fox and it's not a real fox. And so we really wanted to use live predators, and because we're not sure what prey respond to. Maybe it's the sound of a predator, or the sight, or the smell, and it's very hard to guess what that is. So if we use the real predator, we don't have to guess that. The animal can just respond to whatever it wants to. The ethics of that, if we were putting animals into a very small area, that would be ethically, I don't think it would be ethical, but we're putting them into these very large areas. They're about 25 square kilometres, and we only have a few cats in there. So, the animals are living naturally in the wild. Yes, there are a few predators in there, but in general, they're just going about their daily business and learning to avoid them, either through near risks, near misses, and things like that, or through being more aware of the predators. So yeah, we've shown that we can have those animal populations grow and learn in the presence of cats.
But still, sustained, successful, beyond the fence reintroductions do remain elusive.
Yes, there's one thing to sort of train an animal to be more aware of a cat, but if you release it outside and there's just too many cats there. So we need a two-pronged approach. We need to improve the responses of our native animals, but we also need to get better at controlling feral cats and foxes. And so, a lot of our research at Arid Recovery is working on both of those approaches. And I guess a third approach as well is just having really good habitat quality. Because when you have a habitat that has a lot of grass and a lot of trees and a lot of shrub cover, a lot of three-dimensional structure, it means the native animals can hide, they can escape from cats. It's much harder for cats to hunt. So, maintaining that land condition, and as I was talking before about controlling kangaroos and trying to get that understory back, that's all really going to help wildlife species able to coexist with cats and foxes.
So, Katherine, if you look at the history of ferals in Australia, it's a bit of a disturbing picture over the years. So many introduced species taking over and having, I guess, in some cases, very unintended effects, and then the introduction of things like calicivirus to try and control some of the problems we have. And we've had, other issues, with cane toads and fire ants and you name it. Where do you see us sitting in terms of trying to get a handle on the whole feral problem now? Are we having some small wins? Are we going backwards? What are the prospects for the future of more reintroduction of native species like the ones you've been talking about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think these new genetic approaches are really exciting. I mean, they're a long way off, but I think there's some hope on the horizon there. I do think we have a lot better understanding now of what the impacts are and the type of tools we can use, and we're integrating those approaches so that we've got multiple tools, happening. And we have got some wins. So I was involved in the release of the Western Quoll in the Flinders Ranges, in the Ikara Flinders Ranges National Park. And that's still been that's successful 10 years on. There's still Western Quolls and brush-tailed possums running around in the park, and we've managed to get them established outside of fences. There's a really good project in Western Australia at Muddawa, where they've got bilbies and other species outside of fences, using a range of cat and fox control tools. So there's certainly some projects that are working, and I think we're learning from them, and we're learning to apply those methods over in other areas as well. So I think the move towards more and more fences and island safe havens is, to me, I mean, it's good to have insurance populations behind fences and on islands, but we create a lot of problems with these areas. We get overpopulation. We just breed naive animals that never been exposed to predators. We get genetic inbreeding. So I think, we need to shift our focus to trying to save animals across broader landscapes. One example is the bilby. It's declining in the wild, but we've never had more bilbies behind fences in safe havens. They're doing really well in safe havens, and yet in the wild they're continuing to decline. So, we need to sort of start shifting our focus now to those broader landscapes and implementing these tools that we've learnt about in the last few decades.
What are your future goals for the conservation work you and John are doing?
Yeah, we'd love to see animals outside our fence reserve. So we've got 4,000 hectares fenced, but we've got another 200 odd square kilometres that's unfenced. So we'd love to get animals out into that area. I guess there's one thing we'd really love to try, and that is we'd love to try using dingoes to control our kangaroos. And there's sort of, there's technology now where you can actually put GPS collars, electric shock collars or GPS collars on dingoes to try and contain them using virtual fencing. I mean, this is all really new and exciting stuff that hasn't really been shown to work yet, but we'd love to be involved in trials where, we could get dingoes to be contained on our property and not be a risk to any farmers with sheep nearby, but also be controlling the kangaroos and the cats and foxes naturally, using dingoes. And we'd love to try that on our property. But yeah, I think it's probably unlikely at this stage that will ever happen.
Perhaps one final question before I let you go, Katherine, get back to all this important work that you're doing. What really drives you to want to do all this? I mean, you said you were an animal lover like many people are, but why do you really want to do this? What keeps you at it day after day?
Yeah, I think there's a few different things. One is I get a lot of enjoyment about being out in nature and about seeing native animals going about their business and plants and everything just being as it should be. And I think a lot of people do enjoy being outside and being surrounded by nature. So I think that's important on a community level as well. I think, we've got a responsibility because animals in Australia are so unique and so unusual and so amazing that we have a responsibility as a society to try and look after them. I don't want to live in a world that's full of cats and cockroaches. I want to have these unique, amazing animals still around for my children and my grandchildren. And I think, if we look at it from a purely selfish point of view, there's so many discoveries still to be made. I mean, some of these species might have, things that can help cure cancer, or they might, have these amazing benefits for society. And if they go extinct and we lose them, we lose that future potential for all these species. Yeah, and finally, I guess the environment can only be healthy when all parts of the ecosystem are interacting, as they should be. And so it's really important that we get some of these threatened species back in the landscape so they can dig their foraging pits, which catch leaf litter and increase soil carbon and water infiltration, which leads to increased germination. So, everything's really important and works together in the ecosystem, and we're missing a whole suite of species because of local extinctions and declines.
I wish you all the best. As I said at the outset, Katherine's story, written by Kate Legallas, is featured in our new Outback Great Australians magazine, the 5th in this series of amazing individual profiles. You can get a copy from good newsagents or directly from us. Just Google Outback Mag for those details. Thanks for speaking with me, Katherine.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for listening. Catch you next time.